We had heard about the sickness for weeks. Rumors of people dropping in the streets, being run over by carriages and left to rot. No one would touch them for fear of being infected. In just hours, whole villages were seeing symptoms, hundreds dead in days. I lived in a small farming village with my mother and father. We were secluded where we lived. There were only 4 houses spread over 20 miles. People from the cities would drift by on their way to safety and tell us what they'd heard about the fever. But no one else came after a while. Not even the mailman. A week, a month, 2 months passed, and we hadn't seen a soul. My father and mother decided to leave, but I told them I couldn't come. The family that lived on the last farm east was very dear to us, and they had small children. I told my mother I would go to see if they were okay and ask if they would come with me. After that, I would follow my parents south to where my aunt lived. Mother cried, but I would not be swayed. I watched them leave as the sun rose over the dirt road. I had a 20-mile walk in front of me, and so I began. There are those who doubt my story after this point. Some say I'm simply lying. Others speculate I had the fever, and what I saw was only in my mind. I know I wasn't sick. I wish it was all a terrible hallucination, but I know what happened was real. It is midnight on the 3rd of November, 1723. I am a condemned woman. I am scheduled to be hanged in the morning. I have no reasons left to lie. This document will be seen only after I'm dead. Let this be my last testament. As I walked the path, I noticed a distinct silence in the trees. Sounds I had heard all my life were simply gone. And then I heard her. She was coming down the path. A smile arched across her face. She moved lightly, almost skipping. Not a care in the world. A large crimson stain sat dark at the frayed neck of her dress. Blood. "Are you okay, miss?" I asked as she passed by. It wasn't until she was only inches from me that I recognized her. The look in her eyes and that terrible smile made it hard for me to notice at first, but now I could see it was Mrs. Shannon. She lived on the farm closest to ours. She had never been one to smile. She didn't look at me when I talked to her, only continued to sing. I assumed then that she had the illness and her mind was gone. I watched her for a few minutes and then turned and kept going. After about a minute, I looked back. She stood about 100 yards away with her back to me. Her head was turned sideways, listening. I ran the rest of the way. I arrived at the house just as the sun began to set. I knew something was wrong as soon as I laid my eyes on it. There were no cows in the pasture, no goats. I jogged to the front door and knocked. Nothing inside moved. Flies buzzed in the kitchen where dirty dishes sat out exposed. Maggots slithered on the plates, finishing what was left of a week-old dinner. A trail of blood led to the back of the house where the bedrooms were. I moved slowly. The smell was even worse here. Mr. Peters lay on the floor beside the bed. His neck was torn and blood had pooled black beneath him. He'd been dead for days. Something moved in the closet. I hadn't seen the children. I had to check. Though I have to admit at this point I was terrified. I tried to keep quiet as I opened the door. It was the eldest, James. He was cowering in the corner. I took him to his room and gave him some of the water and food I had brought. I asked him what happened. He told me the whole story. A few weeks ago, a drifter had come to town with a fever. Mrs. Shannon let him stay in her barn. He told her it wasn't the illness that made him sick now, but that he had been attacked by a vampire on the road. She thought he was delirious. After he died, she and her husband buried him in the cemetery. A few days later, Mr. Shannon told his wife he had seen the man outside. The drifter said he needed his shoes. They had fallen off while they were transporting his body. After a few moments, the man left. For the next few days, they were plagued by knocks at their door during the night. One of these nights, Mr. Shannon had enough. He went out with his gun and told the man he would shoot him if he didn't go. The man began to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Shannon didn't see what happened, but when morning came, she went out and saw her husband dead on the ground. James told me that a few days prior to my arriving, Mrs. Shannon came asking for help. She said her husband had crawled out of his grave and was trying to get into the house. James's parents turned her away, thinking she was either sick or telling the truth. Either way, they were too scared to open the door. Mrs. Shannon returned not long after. That big grin, those wild eyes, she smelled of rot. She would come in the night, sing songs outside their windows. He told me his 8-year-old sister Elizabeth was the first to die. For reasons no one could understand, she had gone out of bed just before dawn and walked outside. He remembers having dreamt of a girl screaming for help. When he awoke, he realized the sounds were real. They found her a few hours later, sitting against a tree, a few yards into the woods. All the joints in her body had been twisted the wrong way. Before they buried her, his father bound her broken wrists with a rope and salted the earth above her. After a few days of hiding in the house, they ran out of supplies and decided to leave. His mother was killed while trying to gather goats. James and his father took their guns and searched the woods for the vampire, but there was no sign of it. They left her body where it fell and followed the road north. When night came, they found themselves surrounded. They would hear laughter coming from the forest and running feet cutting across the path behind them. James swears he heard his mother calling for him to come into the woods. In a panic, they headed back to the house. His father was briefly attacked along the way, and by the time they got inside, he was just barely breathing. I asked James if he knew who it was that had killed his father, and he told me it was his sister, 6 days after she died. In the end, I decided it didn't matter if it was true or not. James was weak and needed help. There were still usable supplies at my house. We had to leave. It's safer in the day, he told me. He wouldn't budge. He wouldn't let me bury his father either, but at least he let me put the body outside. The silence was still palpable. There were no crickets, not even a gust of wind to make me feel better. It was as if someone had taken our little village and cut it out from the rest of the world. Before I went back inside, I scanned the tree line expecting to see only darkness. There was a small purple dress obscured by low branches near the edge of the forest. At first I was elated. I could tell it was Elizabeth. She was caked in dirt. I thought because she had gotten lost in the woods and finally found her way out. I took a few steps toward her. She returned the favor and started walking to me. Her bones were all broken. She limped across the road like a puppet on strings. Each step she took would tear a new piece of flesh or crack another bit of bone. With absolute horror, I studied her face. She only smiled and held out her arms to me, wrists still bound. I ran back inside. James and I barricaded ourselves in the back bedroom and waited. I turned the lantern down to just barely a spark. We sat in the dark and listened. We heard his mother calling outside. "James, Mommy's waiting." I could see the tears dripping down his cheeks. Elizabeth put her eyes between the cracks in the wood. "Don't you miss us, brother?" James begged her to leave. She said she would, but first she had to tell him something. He leaned in near the wall and she whispered in his ear. Then she left as promised. James sat without saying a word. He picked up the lantern and raised the flame. I asked if he was okay. He opened the globe and poured the oil down his throat. In seconds, he was covered in flames. I screamed. I wanted to help him, but there was no way. The room was overcome in just moments. I rushed to escape. Smoke filled every inch of the space. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. By the time I stumbled outside, it was almost dawn. I was so overcome by the smoke in my lungs that I lost consciousness. When I awoke, there was nothing left of the house or of James. A gash ran across my wrist. I had lost a lot of blood in the night, but I could still move. I tore a piece of my dress and wrapped the wound. When I could walk, I wandered north towards the closest town. Somewhere along the way, I heard the light and ringing of a tiny bell. I came across a cemetery and saw that the bell I was hearing was from a grave. Someone inside was pulling it as if to say they had been buried alive. I walked to it, and as I did, another bell began to ring. Then another and another. I ran and never looked back. I thought I'd hurt my wrist while leaving the house, but now I realize that while I was unconscious lying on the grass, they fed. In a few hours, I'll be put to death for something I did not do. The people here think themselves civilized. They don't believe in monsters. I tried to warn them, but they won't listen, won't take precautions. They'll bury me tonight, and tomorrow morning, I'll be ringing my own bell.
Dig deeper at sessionsx.tumblr.com.
I am afraid of what's lurking in the dark, yet I am afraid to put on the light. I just feel like standing here, waiting to the natural light come in when the morning comes. I can feel the evil all around me. It sends shivers up my spine. I am tired of standing, so I will sit. I feel like sleeping, but I can't sleep. I feel tired, but at the same time, I feel wired. The light switch is there, right across the room from me. I could stand up and walk over any minute and leave this God-forsaken room, open the door and just leave, and never come back. But I don't want to. I went from sitting down on the ground to lying down. I fell in between sleep and waking. I didn't want to fall asleep, as if I fell asleep, then what was in the dark could have all its own way. I could smell a horrible smell. I could feel a presence. The morning came. I was lying down as long as I could without opening my eyes. but I knew I eventually had to, and sure enough, when I did, there were 4 of my friends lying in a pool of blood. I don't know what came over me, but I killed them all. I couldn't control myself. What will I do now? How can I live with this? Then I could hear something. I got a start. I looked out the window. There was a police car. I didn't expect to be caught so soon. Then I froze as the police came in and ignored me. Then I realized they weren't ignoring me. As I could see, there were more bodies on the ground than 4. That's because the 5th one was the dead body of myself that lay there on the ground with my friends. Then it dawned on me about taking the tablets last night to overdose. They had worked. I was dead. Then something told me to look out the window, and I saw 4 of my friends staring right at me. Sharon was walking down the street, sure that someone was following her. She didn't dare look behind, as she would rather just walk on and hopefully get to somewhere where there were people around, other than turn around and have someone attack her. It was getting dark, and she saw a train station across the road, so she walked across to it. When she got into the station, thankfully there were other people in the platform, but strangely, she didn't feel any bit safer. She thought about getting on a train, but decided to just wait by a group of people first to gather herself. She assumed it was just her paranoia, but there was something bothering her that she didn't know what it was. People were acting strange, and she had noticed there were police around. She had wondered why there was no train, as she was standing there for a few minutes now. There were lots of people looking down in the track, across a tape that said "Police line, do not cross." She didn't realise sooner because she seemed to be in a daze, wondering why she was feeling so strange. She wondered what all the people were looking at, and when she walked over and looked down, she screamed with horror as she looked down at herself, dead on the train line. She was screaming and screaming, but no one seemed to take any notice of her. She had then noticed someone had made eye contact with her, and they seemed to notice her. They walked over to her and said, "Did you just realise you're like me, one of the dead?" She spoke on. "Don't worry, it gets better. I watch the news to see where there are local deaths. That way at least you could talk to someone." Sharon froze, taking in the words that the girl was telling her, realising she was dead. It was a Friday night and I was scrolling through my phone when I opened the TikTok app. I scrolled through it, then noticed I had a message. I opened the message and it was from a guy called Frank. He said, "You were looking beautiful at the mall today." I blocked him instantly as I felt a shiver run up my spine. I just put it down to some creep trying to freak me out, so I didn't pay much more attention to it. The next day, I was in the mall with my friends, and we were just walking after coming down the escalator when a man was standing in front of me as I got off. I said, "Excuse me," very politely. He turned around and said, "I'm very sorry for blocking you. Please pass." His words, "very sorry for blocking you," sounded so creepy. It felt as if he was the guy who had sent me the message last night. But how could that be? I told my friends, and they agreed it all sounded a bit creepy the way he worded it. I was hoping it was just a coincidence. That night when I went home, I received another message, which must have been the same guy. This time he said, "You shouldn't have blocked me." He must have set up a new account to just send me that. I jumped when I suddenly heard a noise outside my door. There was a piece of wood stuck up against it, with "You're blocked" written on it. I was shaking with fear and went to my window to try to get out, but I knew it was too high, and when I looked down, I could see the man below from the mall staring right up at me. I rang the police and stayed in my room until they came. When they arrived, the wood was gone from my door, and the man was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't understand the wood disappearing from my door. Then suddenly I woke up. Everything was dark. I know now what woke me. It was my phone. I answered it and could hear a man's voice. As I was saying, "You shouldn't have blocked me," I screamed, "Let me out, let me out." The man said, "There is a straw in your coffin underground. I will be taking that straw out in just under 5 minutes. There had been oxygen pumped into your coffin, but when that's gone, I'm afraid you're on your own. But I threw you a lifeline. I sent your friend a message on TikTok, telling her where you are. If they're a real friend, they will find their way here to save you. But then again, they will need to bring a shovel, etc. So the time is ticking. Tick-tock, tick-tock," he said in a very creepy voice. Then there was silence. What seemed like an hour later, I could hear police sirens, and I thanked God my friend had rang them and got here on time. I was afraid after that to ever go on TikTok again. The man's voice rang in my ears. Tick-tock, tick-tock.